I'm Thomas Klaus. I'm an associate professor at the University of Southern Denmark in the section of Innovation and Design Engineering. It is my pleasure to give you some insights today into our recently accepted paper in the Journal of Supply Chain Management on the perception-based supplier attributes and performance implications. I've co-authored this paper together with Chanchai Tangpong from North Dakota State University. Why should we think about supplier attributes? Quite general, because the importance of suppliers more recently increased, and suppliers take over new roles, such as a greater responsibility for innovation generation in buyer firms. So that led us to the question, influenced by previous research and also our experiences from working with practitioners, are the attributes that are proposed in the dominant models, such as the kind of famous portfolio models, really the ones that operate in the minds of purchasing managers when making decisions about suppliers, for instance, the selection of suppliers. When we looked into the literature, we realized that in most studies, actually, supplier attributes are described decoupled from the relationship. This is kind of puzzling because of basically three reasons. First, supplier attributes actually emerge in the course of repeated interaction in buyer-supplier relationships. So therefore, they cannot be assessed without this particular context. Second, there is this literature on dark side effects of supplier attributes and about supplier-buyer relationships, which cannot be explained without the real context of buyer-supplier relationships. And third, there is a new literature stream about behavioral operations that shows us that decisions that are made by purchasing managers are not always 100% objective, but significantly influenced by bounded rationality and subjective feelings. So this speaks against the idea that objective decisions can be made based on supplier attributes that are pre-described. Based on these observations, our study wants to address two main objectives. First, we would like to expand the concept of the supplier attribute into the perception-based supplier attributes, which we define as the attributes of suppliers that are embedded in buyer-supplier relationships and are inherent in the perceptions of purchasing managers who manage these relationships. In order to attain this first objective, we conducted a series of 60 repertory grid interviews in which we enabled purchasing managers to elicit their perception-based supplier attributes. Second, we want to explore the performance influencing practices that link perception-based supplier attributes to relational outcomes of buyer-supplier relationships. This objective bases on the recently introduced supply chain practice view that suggests that there are certain imitable interorganizational supply chain management practices that can explain differences in the relational outcomes of these relationships. So in order to address the second objective, we conducted a second study based on semi-structured interviews with purchasing managers in order to link the previously identified perception-based supplier attributes with performance influencing practices and relational outcomes of the relationships.
From our study, we found 4 perception-based supply attributes that are associated with performance influencing practices, which in turn associated with relational outcomes as perceived by buyers. And we summarize our finding in this proposed model. And those 4 supplier attributes are proactiveness, trustworthiness, friendliness, and helpfulness. And these 4 attributes positively associate with performance reinforcing practices, which include friction reduction, relationship enhancement, and information and idea exchanges. And these performance reinforcing practices also associated with relational outcomes in terms of cost efficiency and innovation generation. Now, I would like to point out here too that we found trustworthiness, friendliness, and helpfulness to be high relationship-oriented attributes here. These three attributes have high relationship properties, and these high relationship-oriented attributes also associate with performance inhibiting practices, and those are take it for granted, objectivity reduction, compensating for non-economics, where the buyer value the relationships and willing to use that either subconsciously or consciously to make up for economic shortcomings of the suppliers. And these performance inhibiting practices negatively associate with the relational outcomes in terms of cost efficiency and innovation generation from the relationship.
The findings of our study and the proposed model make contribute to two important areas in supply chain research. The first is that we contribute to the supply chain practice view. We offer one potential answer to the question raised when the supply chain practice view was introduced, why the myriad of practices that are per se immutable and transferable, yet still might offer varying performance benefits to supply chains. And one potential explanation here is that it is because certain perception-based supplier attributes influence which particular supply chain practices are utilized in these relationships. The second area of contribution is related to the literature on the dark side of buyer-supplier relationships. We kind of substantiate previous findings on cognitive processes that negatively influence relational outcomes, such as collective blindness or taking things for granted. In addition to what previous studies found, we also see that based on perception-based supplier attributes, objectivity reduction and a compensation for non-economics need to be considered as two new additional constructs in this area of literature. We, of course, also contribute to, we deliver implications for practitioners. I think the most general and kind of overarching recommendation is that purchasing managers should be aware of their own cognitive limitations and their own perception-based supplier attributes, because these lead to the utilization of certain supply chain practices. Second, they also should be aware of the potential pitfalls related to dark side effects of buyer-supplier relationships, because the awareness about these effects may enable them to mitigate these negative practices in the future. So, for instance, by getting external feedback and by reassessing the relationships more objectively from time to time.
Since this study is exploratory in nature, future research could go with a quantitative approach to test the theoretical model proposed here, and that will help us confirm or disconfirm the relationships proposed in the model as well. Future studies could also expand our study conceptually by building on this model and investigating contextual contingencies that potentially amplify or weaken the relationships in the model here. And those contingencies could be in such form as changes in personnel, or changes in key strategic priority of the buyer or the supplier firms. And that would be a good extension and help enrich and expand from the model in this study. Finally, from the methodological standpoint, future research could build on this study by considering the use of mixed methodologies. And the repertory grid technique used in this study is a quite useful tool when the researchers want to study phenomena at the perceptual level. And it can be used in combination with other methodologies as well, such as what we did in this study with the semi-structured interview.